All right, here we are for another biology video. This one, as you can see, is about how new species arise. We've already spent a lot of time talking about natural selection and how natural selection will lead to a change in the population, that the ones with the helpful variations will live longer than those with the unhelpful variations. And as you live longer, then you get to have more offspring. And over time, there's a shift, right? So we know that evolution happens. We've seen it happen in the moths, and we've seen it happen in bacterias, and we've seen it happen in human populations like the bajau. But the question is, are those different species? And the answer is no, they're not. That humans with a big spleen, they're still just humans. And moths that are dark instead of light are still basically the same thing, just with a slightly different coloration, right? So if we want to explain how everything on Earth has gotten to be the way they are, then we need to know, how does a new species arise? But before we can jump into that, we need to define what a species mean. Scientifically, two species would be if there's two organisms who cannot mate, that they are too different to mate. And if they might be able to mate, that they can't make any fertile offspring. So the babies cannot have their own babies. We'll talk about that at the end of the video, right? But first, let's focus on how do you become too different to mate? Now, the traditional way of thinking of this is called gradualism, where one thing slowly changes as natural selection chooses the slightly stronger ones or the slightly faster ones, and then the slightly faster and the slightly faster, and this keeps going over time, right? That's called gradualism. A great example of this are horses. The original horse ancestors back 60 million years ago were kind of like deer. They're about the same size as a deer, and they lived in kind of foresty environments like deer do. Now, this is as far as living in the foresty environment, you can be a small deer-like organism because there's lots of places to hide. And so if a predator like a wolf shows up, you can just go into the forest and then dart in between the trees. Meanwhile, the wolf is trying to run as fast as it can, but it's not as agile as the deer or the Eohippus is. And so this is how you stay alive. But we know that the forests started to disappear and turn into grasslands, into the plains where horses are found now, right? And so as the trees go away, so does your ability to hide behind those trees. So being able to be faster, just straight up sprinting speed, becomes the trait that is the most valuable. And the best way to do that is to get larger. So the small, don't do that. Okay, thanks. The small little horse down there then turns slightly bigger, then gets slightly bigger and slightly bigger and slightly bigger. And it actually started out with actual toes. And then the toes get smaller and fuse together and smaller and fuse together until they have one giant toe that we call a hoof. And a hoof is a good trait for running on the plains because you don't have to worry about like breaking a toe or like kicking something on accident while you're running full speed, right? But the thing is that these slowly turned into those, which turn into those, which turn into those, which turn into those, right? There's one long, slow process of going from the ancestor to the current day horses, right? This is called gradualism. Now, this is sometimes hard for people to understand because the timelines are so long and the change is so slow. And so somebody made this slide to try to illustrate this, right? It starts off red and it ends up blue or purple, blue. This would be like the slow change from evolution. The thing is that if you read this whole thing, it talks about how where is the first purple word or where's the first blue word? And if we were in class, I would ask people to do that kind of thing. And a lot of times they'll point out something like right there, right? Maybe that's the first blue word. I don't know where you were looking at, but that looks pretty close to the beginning of the red or the end of the red and the beginning of the blue or purple. But if you look at that word, the word it's right here, the word color is the same basic color. And so is the word actually, right? The color that came, or the word that came before it and the word that come after it are very similar in color to the word that we're looking at. And it actually doesn't matter where you go on here, you'll find the same problem that no matter what you choose, maybe you thought maybe this would be the one before it and the one after it are still very, very similar, right? And that's because the changes are so small. And it takes so long. And so actually asking the question of where's the first blue word is kind of like asking what came first, the chicken or the egg. That's a fun question to think about, but there isn't really a difference between those things. Technically, if you have to say it, the egg came first because the chicken, if you found the first chicken, it would have had to come from an egg. But really, you're never going to find the first chicken. Somewhere in here is the first chicken. We can't really figure it out, but we do know that if you look from the beginning to the end, that you end up very different, right? So it's hard to grasp this kind of thing when it's such a slow process, but it does happen, as evidenced by the horses, right? And so that's called gradualism. Now, one problem, if gradualism is the only version of evolution that you know of, then this leads to questions such as, if humans came from chimps, then how come there are still chimps, right? And with the horse example, it's a very good question, right? These horses exist now because these ones turned into them, right? This guy doesn't exist, not because it went extinct, but because they just turned into those ones, right? And so that would be the same thing for humans. Like if humans came from chimps, then shouldn't the chimps have all turned into humans? But there's actually another way for speciation to happen. This is called divergence, where one group splits into two or more groups, and then the two groups, after they split, they eventually become different species thanks to natural selection, right? So on this image, you have both versions. You have the gradualism, where this one slowly turns into this one, but then you have the divergent method, where one group splits off from the original group and they become these birds. Meanwhile, this one still exists because that group still exists, just like the chimps are still out there. The humans broke off from the chimp group and become humans. Meanwhile, the chimps just stayed as chimps, right? And so this is actually a much more common way for speciation to happen. And in fact, you can see, I didn't point this out before, but there are a few branching points, right, where something would split off. However, those branching points led to dead ends. So these animals did go extinct, leaving just the horse, the one long horse lineage, right? So again, diverging into two groups is a more common way for speciation. And this leads me to thinking about the rock pocket mice that you watched the video about, right? That their groups are splitting into two different groups, the light group and the dark group. The question is, are they becoming two different species? And at the moment, the answer is no. If you take this mouse and you put them together in a cage, and one's female, one's male, they'll make some babies, and those babies will be able to have their own babies. They are still just two different versions of the same species. But they are on the path to becoming two species, because the number one thing, actually the only thing that matters for making two species from the original one, is called reproductive isolation. Reproductive isolation is exactly what it sounds like. You want to keep the two groups from reproducing with each other, right? Genetically isolated populations will evolve separately, and if you wait long enough, they should end up different from each other. So here's my hypothetical population of gray dots. They're all one big group. And let's say a mutation shows up for the red dot, right? So the red dot mutation shows up, and this is a good one. It's a beneficial mutation. As we know, natural selection will then lead to the red population getting bigger and bigger, the gray population shrinking. So eventually, they would all become red, probably, or most of them. But what if there's a barrier, something that keeps the group on the left from reproducing with the group on the right? These dots will all become red, but these won't, because the only way to get the red mutation is to mate with a red dot. But you can't mate with a red dot when you got this barrier in the middle, right? And so this group will become all red. This other group that doesn't have the mutation, they won't be red, but maybe they'll get a different mutation, right? They might get the blue mutation. And so over time, you end up with the red group and the blue group. They all started as the gray group, but then reproductive isolation has led them to evolve separately, right? Because different mutations will arise in the gene pool, and each group will have its own pressures. Natural selection will be leading them towards whatever different direction the environment leads them in. And so right now, we're going to talk about the different versions of reproductive isolation. Kind of like how there's just one version of natural selection, but there's all these different ways that it could happen: predation, selection, sexual selection. We have our reproductive isolation, but there's different versions of that. So the most common and the easiest one to conceptualize is called geographic isolation, right? And it should make sense that you can't reproduce with another organism if it's physically not near you to reproduce with, right? If you have a population of beetles and somehow a river shows up in the middle of that population and splits them into two, the beetles can't cross the river. The beetles on one side get a mutation to make them more greenish. These guys stay more brown. Maybe the river dries up in the future and the two groups can come back together, but guess what? It's been so long, and natural selection has been working on them each for so long that they are now so different that they can't reproduce anymore, and we would call them two different species. Something similar is happening in the Grand Canyon, where you have these two chipmunk species that are on opposite sides, right? And I don't know what you know about the Grand Canyon, but the Grand Canyon used to be just all flat. And then this Colorado River came through and slowly like dug the Grand Canyon, right? And like carved it out. And so the deeper the canyon got, the more unlikely that the chipmunks on this side would ever find the chipmunks on that side, right? And so now they are two different groups and they are geographically isolated, right? And so if you're not in the right place, then you can't reproduce and you might turn into a new species given enough time. But that's not the only way. A more interesting way might be behavioral isolation. You could be in the same physical location as the other organisms, but something that you do doesn't attract the mates. Now, the greatest examples of these come from birds. Bird songs or insect songs, like the chirping of a cricket. Those are actually advertisements for reproduction, right? When you, in the mornings when there's all those birds and it's springtime and there's chirping everywhere, that symphony is just actually a bunch of birds yelling out like, here, come have sex with me, please. I sing my song really well. You'll like me, right? Sexual selection. The song of one species is different from the song of another species. And you can imagine that if there was one group of birds that all had the same song, but for some reason there was a mutation and one of the males starts to sing a different song, probably most of the females won't mate with him. And maybe that would be a bad mutation and he'll never get a mate and that mutation will just end. But if he has a mutation that makes him sing a different song, and then maybe just one of the females also might have a mutation that makes it so that she kind of likes this new song. Well, now they're going to start mating and having their kids. And then you have the other group doing the original song and they'll have their group. And as long as they don't mate with each other, they could end up as different species, right? One of those famous examples of this is the courting ritual of the blue-footed boobies. That's what these blue-footed birds are called. And they do a very interesting mating ritual, which I need the song to go away because it's annoying. But here we have a male blue-footed booby. He is on the lookout for females and he has spotted one. So he's on his way over to go try to impress her with his dance. Now you'll already start to notice he's doing a little bit something weird with his feet. That's part of the dance. They lift their feet up in like this very exaggerated manner. And then on the left here, you'll see he does this. It's called the pointing ritual. Right? Like that's not an accident. He literally put his head up and then brought his wings up in that weird way. They're both doing the foot thing. He's about to do something where he takes that piece of grass or straw and he waves it around her head like some sort of crazy like magic dust that's like, oh, you will find me attractive if I do this, right? And then the whole time he's supposed to be trying to do the dance and he remembers, right, I like it, like he's like, oh wait, my foot, I'm supposed to do the foot thing. So he like slowly lifts his foot up. He's not doing the dance very well, actually, right? He's not very coordinated. He doesn't seem to be going for anything in particular. He's just kind of doing the foot thing, kind of doing the straw thing. He only did the pointing part one time. He's not doing a very good job. So the female is now about to, she's not interested. She's going to find a male that does a better dance, right? So it's not just the physical looks that get you your mates. It's also the behaviors that give you, that could earn you a mate. Now, the thing about these blue-footed boobies is that there are other versions of these out there, and these are called the red-footed boobies. So they're a different species than the blue-footed ones. You would imagine that at some point they were all one part of the same population, but at some point one group started doing a different dance than the other group. And in fact, the red-footed ones do have their own dances, their own mating ritual, different from the blue-footed ones. And so soon you had two groups, and one was the dance this way and the other group danced this other way. Eventually their feet changed colors as well, and other changes, right? There's other mutations that happen in one group versus the other group. And eventually they are two different species. Nowadays, I don't know about these species, but there are plenty of other birds and animals that they would be able to reproduce if they chose to, but they don't choose to because their behaviors are the wrong behaviors. So behavioral isolation is a very interesting version of sexual selection. One other version of reproductive isolation is for time. You can't mate with something if they are either awake at a different time, right? If you're literally a night owl, and you go out looking for females, but the females that you're looking for are all asleep, then it's going to be hard to find a mate. But more significantly would be the breeding season, like is shown on this graphic, right? You have your wood frogs and pickerel and tree and bullfrogs, and they all have their mating seasons. Notice the bell curves. They don't all mate at the same time. But if you're a wood frog, and for whatever reason you have a mutation that really makes you attracted to the bullfrogs, who mate way later, even if you're at the right place, you're going to be there at the wrong time, right? Maybe you're ready to reproduce because it's April 1st, but the bullfrogs are not ready to reproduce because it's not July 1st. And so nothing's going to happen, right? And so if you're separated by time, then you aren't going to be able to successfully mate with anything. One of the most extreme examples of this are these things called cicadas. We don't have these bugs around here, but they're rather large and found in the South and the Eastern United States. But what makes these ones interesting is that they have a very interesting life cycle. Insects all are born as larvas. You might know that, kind of like caterpillars. But for these guys, it's not exactly a caterpillar. We call them a grub or a larva. And so the larvas of the cicadas live underground, and they eat just other bugs and prey. But they live underground for 17 years. 17 years, they are basically babies. And then after 17 years, they all go through their metamorphosis. And then basically almost at all exactly the same time, of course, there's a bell curve, but generally all at the same time, they all burst up out of the ground and basically take over. And for the next week or so, they just mate and mate and mate. Their entire adult life is about a week or so, and it's full of just sex until they literally fall over and die. But they mated and they had their babies, and now the babies are underground, and they will live underground for 17 years, and the whole thing will happen again, right? People actually go and like this is like a tourist thing, right? Every 17 years, people go to these places and they're like, oh, the cicadas are coming, and they go to watch these bugs just like take over the world for a minute. But how does that have to do with temporal isolation? Turns out that there's lots of different species of cicadas, and there's another one that lives right alongside these guys, but they're called the 19-year cicadas. That's right. Their whole thing happens the same way, but it takes them 19 years to become adults. So when the 17-year ones come out to be adults, they won't mate with the 19 years because the 19 ones are still babies, and vice versa, right? I think I worked it out once that every like 300 years or so, the cycles could match up so that they're all adults at the same time. But by this time, they've been separate for so long that they're not able to reproduce, and they stay as two different species, right? So temporal isolation, another way of keeping organisms from reproducing. Now, temporal and behavioral and geographic, these are all ways to physically make it so mating is not possible. But sometimes there are organisms that are in the right place at the right time, and they have the right behaviors that they could maybe mate. But they don't because of something called zygote mortality, or the embryo, the growing baby dies, right? The genes from the one doesn't work with the genes from the other individual. Even though they might be similar, they still aren't close enough. And I know this is a weird one to say, but if you could imagine that a human and a chimpanzee, it would be theoretically possible for mating, for the act of mating to happen. But you're not going to get a baby of any kind because the chimp genes and the human genes are now too different. Even though chimps are 99% the same DNA as us, their DNA is too different and you can't make a baby that way, right? And so this is what keeps most species separate. And of course, you could choose any crazy combination of things like a crocodile and a deer. Like those aren't, that you obviously can't get a half crocodile, half deer thing, right? But there are other things like deer versus moose, right? I don't think that they're close enough together. Maybe they could try to make a baby, but I don't think anything would happen because they are still too different. So this is called genetic incompatibility, right? It's not a physical thing, and now it's a genetic thing. But again, like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, you might know that there are some species that are similar enough to mate and babies will come out. For example, a mule. A mule is a mix between a horse and a donkey, and it has basically half horse traits and half donkey traits. Donkeys are short, but they're really strong and kind of mean. Horses are taller and faster and not quite as mean. A mule is somewhere in between. It's taller than a donkey, strong like a donkey, but tall like a horse, fast like a horse. They're really useful animals. People, as you know, or maybe you'll know, that people use them as pack animals for a very long time. Like you get the whole like gold rush thing, where like somebody packs up their mule and then like goes out and tries to find the gold, and the mule has like all the tent and all the mining tools and all those things because they're great pack animals because they're very strong and fast. But a mule cannot have its own baby. Mules are sterile because of the way the genetics work from the half horse, half donkey genes. When the mule tries to make its sperm or eggs, the sperms are basically broken or the eggs are broken. They don't work right. And so you can't have a baby, right? So this is what keeps the horses and the donkeys from merging into the same species, right? If they could make babies, then you would get lots of donkeys or mules out there, but they stay as horse and donkey because of this hybrid sterility is what it's called. Another example is this guy. This is called a liger. That's right. It's not just from Napoleon Dynamite. A male lion and a female tiger can have something that looks like this. Now, this is a great example. I like this one because in nature, this would never happen. Lions live in Africa, in particular the central and eastern part of Africa, whereas tigers live in Asia, India and Asia and other places. So they are already separated by thousands of miles of distance. You're never going to find a lion meet a tiger in real life. But in a zoo, where this picture was taken, it does happen sometimes. I forget why. I think maybe sometimes people actually do this on purpose. I would imagine that this wouldn't be from like big public zoos, but more from like private people that own tigers and things like that. But as you can see, it's huge. I forget exactly the details, but there's something about the growth genes. When you get the male liger and the the male lion and the female tiger, it ends up getting a double dose of like growth hormones, and it ends up this monstrous thing. But like the mule, they can't have their own babies, which is a good thing, of course, because we don't want a bunch of these things running around the world, right? Like this is literally like a monster that I don't like. What kind of animal could compete with that thing? Like maybe a polar bear could fight that thing, but that would something this big would definitely have a very big survival advantage out in the wild. Although I do have to point out that because their genes don't really match up very well, they do have a lot of weird physical problems, and they die really young because their bodies really just aren't meant to be working the way that they work. Finally, we have this guy. This is called a beefalo. That's right. It's a buffalo and a cow. Now, the reason I bring this one up is that the beefalo actually can have its own babies. This is where I was mentioning earlier, or maybe I didn't mention earlier, but I should have, that this idea of a species is kind of still a gray area, right? The idea that they can't mate is generally works, but then you find these things, right? So I guess in that sense, a buffalo and a cow are biologically still the same species, and that the only real difference between a buffalo and a cow is the fence that the human put there to keep them separate, which actually doesn't work very well because actually buffaloes break the fences and break in and have sex with the female cows relatively often. I've read that it's kind of a big problem in places where there's lots of buffaloes. But as long as humans keep the cows separate from the buffaloes, then maybe in a few more thousand years, they will officially be totally two different species, like the lions and tigers and the horses and the donkeys, right? So this is now tells us how we can get so many different species on the planet from natural selection, working on one group that splits into two groups, and then the two groups become very different. We will learn more examples of these as we go along. Please be sure to ask any questions that you have in the question so that I can address them on the next video.